Welcome, weary soul. You've come to the right place to let the world fade away. Tonight, we'll drift together into a time long past, where the air was dry, the towns are few, and every step echoed beneath an endless sky. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts unravel, and if stories like this help you rest, remember to subscribe before sleep takes you. The air was dry, warmer than any morning you could remember, and it smelled faintly of dust and old leather, like the inside of a forgotten trunk that had been sitting untouched in a sunlit attic for generations. You weren't sure if your eyes were open or closed at first, because the sky above you was so blindingly bright that it seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. A searing pale blue dome with no cloud in sight, no shade, and no memory of rain. It pressed down with silent weight, not in anger, but in a kind of heavy stillness that suggested time had slowed here, like a place paused, waiting for someone to wake and see it. You became aware, gradually, of the dry ground beneath your back. It wasn't pavement or soil as you'd known it. It was coarse and sun-baked, a mixture of dust and old gravel and tired yellow grass that cracked under even the gentlest shift of your weight, sending a small puff of earth into the shimmering air. The heat rose around you in waves that shimmered like clear flames, making the horizon blur and ripple as though the world itself were breathing, slow and tired. You blinked, eyes squinting into the brilliance, your lashes fluttering against the sting of the dry wind. There was no sound, none at all, save for the faintest rustling, like the whisper of old paper or the sigh of worn fabric being moved by ghostly hands. No engines, no buzzing wires, no voices or distant traffic. Nothing modern, just silence, wide and complete, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you feel the throb of your own heartbeat. You sat up slowly, your spine stiff and uncooperative, and felt every movement echo through your limbs as if your muscles had been asleep for far longer than they should have. The clothing on your body wasn't yours, or at least not the sort you would have chosen. The fabric was thick and rough, darkened by sweat and sun, smelling of dust and horse, and something almost metallic, like old tools or dry blood. There were suspenders biting slightly into your shoulders, holding up trousers made of a coarse wool that itched just slightly at the knees. You looked down and saw scuffed leather boots on your feet, warm but solid, coated in a film of desert dust. Your hands were your own, or so they seemed, but the skin looked more weathered than you remembered, and your fingertips were stained faintly with what might have been oil or soot or gunpowder. A thick leather belt circled your waist, and attached to it, half tucked into a faded holster, was the unmistakable outline of a revolver. You weren't sure whether to be afraid. The air tasted old, like the pages of a book that hadn't been opened in 100 years. You stood, carefully, brushing yourself off with slow, deliberate movements, as if the land itself required you to move respectfully. A long, dusty road stretched out in front of you, disappearing into a mirage that danced on the horizon. Behind you, that same road led backward into nothingness. No structures, no trees, no signs. Just emptiness. There was a single crooked post sticking out of the ground a few feet away, leaning slightly, as though time had bent it with years of wind and heat. Nailed to it was a piece of weathered parchment that flapped ever so slightly, its edges curling like dried leaves. As you stepped closer, your boots crunching softly on the dry earth, you could make out the faded letters stamped across the top in large block print. Wanted. The ink had bled slightly from time and sun, but the face wasn't yours. Not yet. The eyes on the poster were hollow-looking, the jaw stern, the reward some barely legible. But something about the shape of the nose, the angle of the brow, made your stomach tighten in a way you couldn't explain. The silence around you shifted, just slightly. You turned, slowly, and far in the distance you saw the outline of a rider, just a blur against the heat-shimmered haze, a slow-moving figure that made no sound but stirred something in you, as though you were remembering a scene from a dream you had not yet had. The rider drew closer, not in a rush, but with a patience that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd crossed this stretch of land. His horse, a dark and mottled beast, moved steadily, unbothered by the heat or the quiet or the fact that it seemed to emerge from nowhere. The man in the saddle wore a long duster coat that fluttered gently in the dry wind. His hat, wide-brimmed and low, obscured most of his face, but you saw the shadow of a beard, the curve of a scar on one cheek, and a distant glint of eyes that seemed to take you in without surprise. He didn't speak. He didn't stop. But as he passed just a few yards away, he lifted one hand slowly, removed his hat, and tossed it in your direction. Not like someone handing over an object, but like someone passing on a memory or returning something long lost. It landed at your feet in a puff of dust and silence. You bent to pick it up, brushing it off instinctively, and saw inside the rim a name scrawled in faded ink. Elijah. The name meant nothing. And yet, your hand trembled slightly as you held it, a strange and sudden weight settling in your chest, as though the name had reached deep into something sleeping inside you. You looked up again, and the man was gone. No sign of him or his horse. No hoof prints. No trail in the dust. Just you and two hats. The one already on your head, and the one cradled in your hand. The wind whispered again, a little stronger this time, as if the world around you had sighed in recognition. Your gaze turned back toward the road ahead, the one that led into the heat haze, toward the distant shapes that might have been buildings or cliffs or just tricks of the light. You felt no compulsion to turn back, partly because you weren't sure there was anything behind you, and partly because something about the road forward called to you. Not loudly, not even clearly, but in a slow, steady pull, like a current moving beneath a calm river surface. Your feet began to move without instruction, each boot step sinking gently into the powdery dirt, and the two hats, one worn, one held, swayed with your rhythm. There were no road signs, no maps, no questions. Only the heat, the dust, and the long way forward, stretching into the silence of the past that somehow felt like home. And somewhere far ahead, just barely visible in the glow, the outline of something began to form, a shape too distant to define, too familiar to ignore, as if it had been waiting there all along, knowing this moment would come. The shape on the horizon never stayed quite still. One moment it looked like a crooked wooden signpost marking the edge of some forgotten trail, and the next it resembled a small structure, perhaps a shack, perhaps a wagon, or maybe just a rock formation leaning toward collapse under the weight of time. You kept walking anyway, not out of curiosity exactly, but because the stop would have felt wrong, as though this world required your movement, as though stillness would make you disappear entirely, swallowed up by the long, yawning silence that blanketed everything in a soft, unrelenting hush. The sun never moved, or if it did so slowly, in lazy circles, casting shadows that stretched long and then longer again, making every fence post, every brittle tuft of grass, every glimmering stone feel stretched thin, like tired bones just trying to stand. Your feet dragged a little now, not from exhaustion exactly, but from that strange heaviness that comes when you're not sure where you are or why you come, but your body insists on going all the same. Eventually, the shape ahead resolved into something more tangible. A structure, yes, but not one made with the proud hands of builders. It looked more like something cobbled together from remnants, scraps of wood and tin and rope, a shelter rather than a building, leaning heavily to one side as though it had been pushed into place by the wind. Beside it was a small, broken hitching post, and tied to it was a horse, or something that looked like a horse, standing still and glassy-eyed, as if carved from shadow. You blinked at it for a long time before you realized it was real, or at least real enough to cast a shadow of its own. The horse didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to notice you at all. It just stood there, breathing so quietly that its ribs barely shifted beneath the worn leather saddle. You didn't approach it, not just yet. Instead, you moved toward the structure and pushed gently against the door, if it could be called that. It was little more than two slats of wood held together by rusted nails and a scrap of rope, and it swung inward without resistance, creaking softly on unseen hinges. Inside it was dark, not pitch black, but the kind of gentle darkness that invites quiet, the kind that muffles thought and wraps sound in wool. The air was cooler here, just slightly, and it carried a faint scent of tobacco, old whiskey, and sweat. A counter ran along one wall, scarred and dented, and behind were shelves lined with bottles, some full, most empty, all dusty. There was no barkeep, no music, no laughter, just an old saloon left breathing in silence, as if it had been waiting for years for someone to walk to the door again and remind it what life had once sounded like. Your boots made soft, hollow thuds on a wooden floor as you stepped farther inside, your fingers trailing lightly along the edge of a nearby table, which wobbled slightly under your touch, as though startled to be touched again. A single lantern hung from the ceiling by a length of chain, swaying just faintly, as if stirred by your presence. And then you saw him, seated in the corner near the window, half shrouded in shadow, one boot resting on the rung of a chair, the other stretched out under the table. He wasn't hiding, but he hadn't moved either, and you hadn't noticed him until now, as though the shadows themselves had only just allowed you to see. He wore a long coat, unbuttoned, with a vest underneath that had seen better decades. A wide-brimmed hat was tipped low over his eyes, and in one hand he held a glass. Whether full or empty, you couldn't say. You froze, not from fear, but because the moment felt thick, like a page being turned too slowly, its meaning stretching across seconds. Then, without lifting his head, the man spoke, his voice soft and slow, as though each word had been worn smooth by time. "Took you long enough," he said, not unkindly, and the words rolled across the room like smoke. You opened your mouth, not sure what you meant to say, but no words came. He didn't seem to mind. Instead, he gestured toward the bar with the glass in his hand. "Pour one," he murmured. "The good stuff's still in the middle shelf. Ain't much left, but there never is." You moved behind the bar, your fingers brushing against bottles whose labels had peeled away long ago. Dust rose from the glass like memories, and when you found the right one, the one your hand seemed to know by feel, you poured a slow amber stream into a cracked glass, the sound delicate, almost apologetic. You brought it back to the table, but he waved it away. "That one's for you," he said, his mouth curling slightly at one edge. "You've come a long way, even if you don't know it yet." You sat opposite him, glass in hand, and stared out the window. The horse was still there, still unmoving, its presence more symbolic than real. The wind picked up slightly, brushing dust across the windowsill, and from somewhere deeper in the building came the faintest creak, as if the saloon were listening in on the conversation, curious about how the story might unfold this time. The man across from you finally lifted his head, and for the first time you saw his eyes, dark, steady, not unkind, but filled with the sort of tired wisdom that only comes from watching too many endings. "You're not the first," he said simply, "and you won't be the last. The West, it don't let you go, not really, not once you've stepped into it." You wanted to ask him what he meant, but you found yourself simply nodding, as though your body already understood something your mind had not yet caught up to. You took a slow sip from the glass. It burned, but gently, like memory rather than fire. The warmth spread down into your chest and settled there, comfortable, familiar. Outside, the shadows grew longer. The sun, though it had barely moved all day, now leaned ever so slightly toward the western sky. The piano in the corner of the room let out a soft groan, and then, with a whisper keys, a few tired notes echoed out, played by hands you could not see. The man across from you didn't react. He simply leaned back in his chair and let out a breath that might have been a sigh. "You want to find the town soon," he said quietly. "There's answers there or questions. Hard to say which makes more sense anymore." You turned toward him, but his face was hidden once more beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't move again. He didn't need to. The wind outside carried a change with it, a new scent. Something woodsy and worn, something distant yet approaching. You stood slowly, leaving the glass half full on the table, and moved toward the door. Your legs ached, but not unpleasantly, as if walking were the only thing they'd ever been meant to do. You stepped out onto the creaking porch, back into blazing, sleepy afternoon light, and now, in the far distance, you could see something new, a cluster of low buildings, barely visible through the shimmer. A town, maybe, or something like it. You didn't look back. The buildings appeared first as little more than smudges against the horizon, distant outlines softened by the shimmering heat that hovered above the ground like the trembling breath of something sleeping just beneath the dust. Each step you took toward them was met with a soft crunch of gravel underfoot and the steady whistle of a breeze that no longer felt like wind, but more like the memory of wind, as though even the elements themselves had grown old in this place. The road you followed had deep grooves etched into its surface, wheel ruts hardened by time, as if 1,000 wagons had passed through on journeys that were never completed, or perhaps had never even started. Everything felt distant yet near, familiar but not quite knowable, like walking to a place you'd only seen in an old photograph or dreamed about once as a child but could never quite recall in the morning. The sun still hung high, stubborn in the sky, refusing to lower or shift meaningfully, casting an amber glaze across everything it touched. The heat settled like a warm blanket over your shoulders, heavy but strangely comforting, its weight anchoring you in place with each slow, deliberate breath. As you walked, the landscape changed only slightly. A few scattered rocks, the occasional withered shrub, a half-buried fence post leaning at an awkward angle, and then, finally, the scent of something faintly metallic carried on the air. It reminded you vaguely of rust or dried blood or old coins, a sharp edge beneath the dust and the warmth, not threatening exactly, but unsettling in its quiet persistence. Closer now, you could see the town beginning to take shape in detail. A sign stood crooked at the edge of the main road, its paint peeling and would crack by years of sun and silence. The name was nearly worn away, but enough letters remained to hint at what it might have once read. Perhaps Cedar Hollow or Dead Man's Ridge, or something older still, something swallowed up by time and forgotten maps. The town was small, no more than 24 buildings, each one faded and listing slightly, like tired men leaning on one another after a long night with too much whiskey and not enough sleep. The main street was wide but empty, the kind of empty that pressed into your chest, making your heartbeat feel louder than it should. Doors were closed, windows shuttered, and yet you could feel eyes watching, not with malice, not even with suspicion, but with the cautious stillness of people who had learned long ago to keep to their own business and let strangers pass through like ghosts. You stepped across the invisible threshold that marked the entrance to the town, and with that one step, the sound changed. It didn't grow louder, not exactly, but more textured. The whisper of the wind grew deeper, the creak of a distant weather vane groaned with greater purpose, and the boards beneath your feet began to murmur their age with each footfall. You passed an old general store with its windows so dust-coated they looked frosted from within, a barber shop with chairs still sitting in the open doorway as if waiting for its next customer, and a jailhouse whose barred windows cast long, straight shadows across the dirt. There was a stillness of the town that didn't feel dead, only dormant, like something lying low just beneath the surface, waiting to rise again if stirred the right way. At the center of the town stood a saloon, larger than the one you had visited before, its porch wider, its sign hanging by a single chain, swaying just slightly in the breeze. "The Painted Mare," it read, though the paint had faded so thoroughly that the name only revealed itself slowly as the light hit it just right. A horse's head had once been painted beside the letters, but now only a faint outline remained, its eye a hollow knot in the wood. You paused at the edge of the steps, one hand resting lightly on the rail, and for a moment the world around you held its breath. Then the faint sound of a piano playing drifted out from inside. Not a song, not even melody, just slow, meandering notes, almost like someone testing each key to see which one still worked. The sound pulled at something inside you, not an emotion but a sensation, like the recollection of a moment that had never happened but still carried weight. You pushed the door open gently, and it groaned on its hinges like an old man waking from sleep. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through the slats of shutters, and the air was thick with the scent of smoke, old bourbon, and something sweet, perhaps pipe tobacco or the remnants of dried flowers hidden somewhere out of sight. The bar stretched long across one side of the room, its surface worn smooth by countless elbows, and a mirror behind it reflected the room in soft distortions, like it couldn't quite remember what was supposed to show. At the piano sat a man you hadn't seen before. His back was hunched, his shoulders narrow, and he played with the lazy grace of someone who didn't care if anyone was listening. The notes he coaxed from the keys were gentle and inconsistent, like a lullaby half-remembered from childhood, and though he never turned around, you felt that he knew you were there. A few other figures had scattered to the saloon, one at a table near the window, slowly turning a coin between his fingers, another by the bar, nursing a drink and watching the mirror as if hoping to see something appear. No one spoke. No one seemed surprised by your presence. The room accepted you the way the desert had, quietly, without judgment, as if it had been expecting you all along. You found a seat near the center, not too close to anyone, and let yourself sink into the wooden chair. It creaked beneath your weight, but held firm. Your eyes adjusted slowly to the low light, taking in the dusty frames on the walls, the spider webs in the corners, the faded curtains hanging limp in the still air. The piano continued its wandering melody, and the man at the bar raised his glass slightly in your direction. Not a toast, not a greeting, just an acknowledgement that you were here now, part of the room, part of whatever this place had become. Outside, the wind had died down, and the town seemed to settle even deeper into itself, like an old dog curling up for a nap. The sun remained fixed in the sky, not yet ready to set, as though even it had grown too comfortable in this strange stasis to move forward. You closed your eyes for just a moment, not to sleep, but to listen, to the piano, to the silence, to the breathing of the building around you. And in that stillness, you felt it. The subtle shift of something stirring far off in the distance. Something unseen but familiar, making its slow approach toward the town. The sound of the piano faded as gently as it had arrived, not with a final chord or any sort of conclusion, but as though the music had simply wandered away, drifting out to cracked windows and into the heavy stillness of the street, where it could mix with the dust and the sun and the scent of hot wood, becoming one more invisible thread in the endless weave of this forgotten place. The man who played never turned around, never acknowledged the silence that followed. He sat there still, his back hunched slightly, hands resting loosely on the worn ivory keys, shoulders rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm that suggested sleep or meditation, or perhaps a kind of waiting that went far beyond patience, as if his entire being existed only to fill the air with sound when the time was right and to disappear into stillness again when it wasn't. You watched him for a long moment, unsure whether you felt comfort or unease, and perhaps it didn't matter, because both seemed to dissolve under the weight of the quiet. Around you, the saloon held its breath again. The figures inside remained where they were, motionless but not lifeless, more like statues with slow pulses, alive in some quiet, deeply internal way, not needing conversation or movement or even recognition. They had the air of people who had seen things pass and come again, who had outlived stories and become part of the architecture, part of the mood, part of the soft whisper that lived in the floorboards and the glass and the air itself. No one looked at you directly, but you felt their awareness in the way the room held you, in the way the dust mote spun slowly in the light, and the way the wood beneath your chair felt somehow aware of your weight. You stood, eventually, not out of urgency, but because the sense of something drawing closer had returned, not loudly, not insistently, but with the same soft pressure that had pulled you down the road, that had led you to the first saloon, and then to the shape on the horizon, and then here, to this place where names had no weight and time no edges. The figures inside didn't move, didn't follow, and as you stepped out the door, the hinges gave a low groan that felt like a farewell, or perhaps just another breath in the slow exhale of the town. The sun was still high, unmoving, but now the light had shifted just slightly, warmer in hue, softer around the edges, as it prepared itself for something inevitable, something approaching not from above but from the long road beyond. The breeze returned, faint at first and then stronger, tugging lightly at your sleeves, lifting dust into small, dancing spirals that swirled and vanished before they touched the ground again. It smelled now of something different, still dry, still sunbaked, but with a trace of something older beneath it, something metallic and smoky and faintly sweet, like old coins forgotten in a fire. You looked down the road and saw, at the very edge of your vision, the approach of a figure on foot, distant but steady, their silhouette black against the brightness, walking with a gait that carried no hesitation. You couldn't make out details, no face, no clothing, not even shape of their hands. But there was something about the rhythm of their stride that felt like a clock starting again after a long silence, a ticking presence that stirred the air around you, making your pulse slow and heavy in your ears. You stepped down from the saloon porch, your boots landing softly in the dust, and turned to face the figure as they came closer, your breath slow, your limbs loose with that half-dreaming calm that comes when the world around you feels more like a memory than a moment. The town remained quiet behind you, its windows watching through slats and cracks, its shutters trembling just slightly in the growing wind. A sign creaked somewhere above, the chain twisting just enough to make the wood groan. The world was preparing. It seemed for something, though what that was, you still didn't know. The figure drew closer still, and though they were still far off, you felt a weight in their presence, a kind of gravity that didn't pull you in but slowed everything else down around them. The air thickened slightly, not with heat, but with meaning, the kind of quiet meaning that collects in old churches or graveyards or empty bedrooms at midnight. You squinted, try and see their face, but the shimmer in the air made them blur at the edges, like heat rising from a stove or steam from a teacup. Still, you could see that they were walking with purpose, not the kind of sharp, fast purpose of someone angry or afraid, but a slow, deliberate momentum that came from certainty, from a knowledge that wherever they were going was exactly where they had always been meant to arrive. You turned your gaze to the buildings around you, watching for any sign of life. Movement behind curtains, a door nudging open, a face peeking through the slats. But there was nothing. The town was still, more still than before, as if even the wind had stepped aside to make room for whatever was coming. The horse at the hitching post near the saloon lifted its head slightly, then went still again, nostrils flaring once before settling. Somewhere far off, the faint cry of a hawk split the sky, then faded. You looked back at the approaching figure and noticed, for the first time, that they carried something, a long, narrow case slung across their back, the leather worn and cracked, the buckles loose, the edges softened by time. It might have been a rifle or a musical instrument or something else entirely, whatever it was. It seemed to hum faintly in the air, a low vibration that settled into your bones. They walked with it as though it was part of them, not a burden but a companion. Something that belonged there as much as their shadow. You didn't move. You didn't need to. The figure was still too far to call out to, and even if you wanted to speak, your throat had grown dry, not from thirst, but from the weight of the moment. This sense that something was returning, not for you specifically, but for this place, for the story that had paused too long and now sought to resume its next line. The figure walked still, their outline growing clearer now with each step, and you felt a quietness settle over everything, a calm that wasn't peace but the calm of inevitability, of turning pages and drawn curtains and fading candlelight. And still the town waited, and still the figure came closer, and somewhere in your chest, just beneath your ribs, you felt something stir, not fear, not excitement, but recognition, as though a name you had forgotten was about to be spoken again after many, many years. The recognition that bloomed quietly in your chest didn't arrive with fireworks or sharp clarity. It came instead like a half-remembered tune drifting through a dusty window, or the faint scent of a place you once visited in another life, lingering on the edge of breath and memory. The figure continued their approach, the outline no longer wavering but taking on clearer dimensions. Tall, lean, steady, with long legs moving at a pace that neither rushed nor lingered, like someone for whom time had no dominion. And still, the town watched without watching, its stillness deepening, not from fear or reverence, but from a worn patience that only places as old and quiet could possess, a kind of sacred waiting that had outlasted clocks and calendars and the people who once cared for them. You stood in the center of the road, the dust swirling gently at your boots, your shadow long and strange behind you, and as the stranger drew close enough that you could see the outline of their coat fluttering in the soft wind, you felt something within yourself shift, not a thought, not even a memory, but a space, opening like a window you hadn't known was there. The case they carried across their backs swung gently with each step, the old leather glinting in places where the sun struck the worn buckles. Their hat was pulled low, casting their face in shadow, but you could sense that their gaze was fixed not just on the road ahead, but on you, not piercing or threatening, but steady, curious, the way one might look at a doorway and wonder whether to knock. By the time the figure reached the edge of the saloon, they slowed, their boots stirring the dust with a deliberate rhythm, and for a moment, everything in the world seemed to lean forward, the wind, the light, even the boards of the porch, all listening, all waiting for something to be said. But the stranger didn't speak. Instead, they stopped just a few feet from you and lifted one hand slowly to remove their hat. The motion was simple, almost reverent, and as the wide brim tilted back and the light touched their face, you saw features that struck a strange chord in you, not because they were familiar, but because they belonged here, in this place, in this hour, as surely as the cracked boards beneath your feet or the hawks circling high above. Their eyes were pale, not cold, but pale in a way that suggested they had seen through many kinds of darkness. Lines creased the corners of their mouth and eyes, not from age alone, but from squinting into sun and smoke and sorrow. Their skin was the kind that held on to stories, not the stories themselves, but the dust and weight of them, the kind of skin that had known loss and distance, and the slow unraveling of days that came with walking long roads without names. They looked at you for a long moment without speaking. And in that silence, you felt no need to explain yourself, no urge to ask questions. It was as though both of you were pages in the same book, placed side by side, not to be compared, but to make sense of the chapter. Finally, the stranger spoke, and their voice was low, worn, and gentle, like the hum of an old engine starting again after a long sleep. "You've been walking a while," they said, not as a question but as an acknowledgement, a quiet observation that recognized the dust on your coat, the looseness in your limbs, the way your breath moved just slightly too fast. You nodded, and the gesture felt like the dropping of a heavy pack, a silent agreement between you and the road and the moment. The stranger gestured toward the saloon, behind you with a tilt of their head. "They still play the piano in there?" You turned slightly, glancing back at the open door, where the soft echo of the last tune still seemed to hover in the air, like the final note of a lullaby too shy to fade entirely. "Sometimes," you said, surprised at the sound of your own voice, hoarse, slow, barely more than a whisper. It felt like you hadn't spoken in years. The stranger smiled, just a faint curve of the mouth, enough to soften the edges of their face. "That's good. Some places forget." They stepped past you then, walking with that same quiet purpose, and made their way up onto the saloon porch. The boards groaned slightly under their weight, not in protest, but in recognition, like old friends creaking out a greeting after too long apart. You didn't follow right away. You stood there, watching them disappear through the doorway, and for a brief moment, you felt the breeze carry a new scent, something faintly floral like sage or lavender, something alive. You breathed it in deeply, letting it settle into your lungs, your ribs, your spine. Then, slowly, your feet moved again, carrying you not into the saloon, but forward, farther down the main road, past the quiet houses and shuttered stores, past the faded blacksmith sign and the leaning water tower with its rusting frame. The town seemed apart for you, allowing you passage without judgment, without questions. You passed a church, its windows clouded and its bell tower silent, and then a schoolhouse with its door ajar, the chalkboard inside still faintly marked with lessons no one had taught in years. You walked until the buildings thinned out, until the town trailed off into open land once again, and there, just beyond the final post of the last fence, you saw a tree. It was the only one in sight, tall and gnarled and wide, its roots exposed in places, clinging to the earth like a memory refusing to be buried. Beneath it stood a bench, simple, handmade, old. You moved toward it, drawn by something you couldn't name, and sat down without hesitation. The wind was stronger here. It moved your coat, tugged gently at your sleeves, carried the smell of far-off things, horses, rivers, gunpowder, campfires, sorrow. And as you sat, your hands resting in your lap, your eyes staring out at the slow roll of land beyond the town, you began to understand something, not a truth in words, not something you could explain if asked, but a feeling that time here didn't move in straight lines, that you hadn't come from somewhere or arrived at some destination, but that you had always been here in some form or another, sitting beneath the sky, watching the land breathe, waiting for something to begin again. And behind you, far away now, the faint notes of the piano began once more, drifting on the wind like a lullaby you hadn't known you'd missed. The bench beneath you groaned softly as your weight settled further into it. The old would warm from the sun, its edges smooth from long years of weather and waiting. You leaned back slowly, letting your shoulders ease down and your hands fall limply into your lap, fingers brushing against the frayed fabric of your coat. The sky above stretched wide and pale, still unmoving, a canvas of hushed light with no clouds to disturb it, no birds to mark its surface. Just an endless sweep of softness that held the whole world gently in place. The tree above creaked now and then in the breeze, not sharply, but with the tired voice of something ancient speaking only to itself, a kind of lullaby murmured through bark and leaves, shaped by memory rather than language. From far behind you, the piano's tune continued to drift through the air, slower now, more careful, as if the keys themselves had grown contemplative, as if each note had to be coaxed out with a quiet kindness before it would agree to be heard. It came in waves, first distinct, then soft, then barely there, like music filtering through a dream. There was a peace in it, a gentle persistence, the kind of sound that neither demanded attention nor slipped away entirely. It stayed with you, wrapping itself around your thoughts like a worn blanket, filling the space between each breath with something steady and warm. The land beyond the trees sloped gently downward into a shallow valley, its floor coated with long golden grasses that swayed in lazy unison with the breeze. A fence ran along one side, not to enclose anything, but simply to be there, a gesture toward boundaries in a place that no longer needed them. The posts leaned at strange angles, their tops rounded with age, their wires sagging and broken in places. Yet still they held on, stubbornly, as though the act of standing was reason enough. Beyond the fence lay more open space. Not wilderness exactly, but the kind of emptiness that invites wonder, that makes you imagine what stories might have been buried just beneath the soil, under the roots, beside the stones. You found yourself watching the way the grasses moved, the way their dry tips caught the light and shimmered for just a moment before dipping again, disappearing back into the shifting sea. It reminded you, vaguely, of the way candle flames danced, or how people sometimes sway slightly when they speak quietly to one another. It had rhythm, but no urgency. You watched, and you breathed, and time no longer felt like something being spent. It just drifted without need for tracking. The wind picked up slightly, just enough to make your coat flutter against your side, and with it came a new sound, softer than the piano, lighter than the rustle of grass. It was a faint jingle of metal, like spurs perhaps, or coins, or tools being gently nudged in a pocket. You didn't turn to look. The sound didn't startle you, didn't even break your calm. It felt expected, as if part of the song the wind had been building slowly, note by note, across the plains and the rooftops and the empty spaces between. Eventually, the sound came closer, footsteps brushing along the dusty path behind the bench. Slow, even almost cautious, not sneaking, but respectful, the way someone walks in a place that feels sacred or forgotten. The figure moved into your periphery, a shadow stretching out alongside yours, long and soft-edged. And then they sat, without a word, on the far end of the bench, their presence light, like a coat laid gently beside you. You didn't need to look to know who it was. The stranger, the one from before, the one with the pale eyes and the long case and the coat that smelled faintly of horses and sand and something older than either. They didn't speak, and neither did you. The silence that settled between you was not awkward, not waiting to be filled. It was whole on its own, full of the sounds of the wind and the breathing of the land and the gentle hum of old things being remembered. You sat there together, watching the same grasses, listening to the same distant music, and the moment stretched long and loose and without weight. After a while, maybe minutes, maybe an hour, the stranger shifted slightly, one leg crossing over the other with a soft rustle of fabric. Used to be, they said at last, their voice barely more than a whisper. This was the edge of everything, right here. You go any farther, and you were past the maps, past the names. Folks didn't come here unless they had nowhere else to go, or unless something was pulling them. You turned your head slightly, not all the way, just enough to see their profile, whether quiet, unmoved. What pulled them? You asked, your voice dry but calm. The stranger tilted their head a little, eyes still forward. Depends on who you ask. Some say it's freedom. Others say it's the ghosts. Me, I think it's the quiet. There's a kind of truth in places like this. It don't yell at you like it does in the cities. It just waits, lets you find your way to it. You look back at the grasses, watching the wind change direction slightly, rippling them in new patterns. Feels like something's waiting now, you said softly. The stranger nodded once. It always is. A small bird fluttered down onto the fence post across from you, its feathers ruffled by the wind, its head tilting back and forth as it regarded the world with quick, bright eyes. It chirped once, then flew off again, disappearing into the field. The sound seemed to ripple outward, a tiny wave through the stillness, and then everything settled again, as though nothing had happened. You glanced down at your hands, noticing for the first time the dust beneath your fingernails, the faint dark marks on your palms, not grime, but something else, like the residue of dreams left too long in the sun. I don't remember coming here, you said, more to the wind than to your companion. Most don't, the stranger replied. Coming ain't the part that matters. It's what you choose to do after. A silence followed, not empty but rich, like soil after rain. And slowly, you felt your eyelids begin to lower, the weight behind them growing more comforting than heavy. The warmth of the bench and the lull of the wind and the rhythm of the stranger's words weaving around like a shawl pulled gently across your shoulders. You leaned back just slightly, letting your head tilt toward the curve of the tree, and for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, you allowed yourself to simply rest. Not sleep yet, not quite, but the soft beginning of it, the gentle unraveling of tension in your jaw and your chest and your thoughts. The wind moved the branches above like breath through old hymnals, and somewhere behind you, the piano whispered a final, trailing chord. The final note of the piano seemed to carry on the wind long after the music itself had ended, like a shimmer of light that lingers even after the candle is snuffed, or the faint scent of something sweet that stays behind in a room long emptied. It drifted across the open land, curling between fence posts and over tall grasses, brushing lightly against the trunks of distant trees and the sides of quiet buildings, before finally settling into silence once again. One that was full rather than empty, like a soft hand resting on your shoulder, offering nothing but presence. You remained seated on the bench beneath the old tree, your eyes half-lidded, the light filtering through the sparse leaves above, painting shifting patterns across your hands and lap, golden and soft, like the warmth of memory. Beside you, the stranger hadn't moved. Their long coat stirred faintly in the breeze, the leather case still resting against the bench, its surface dark and smooth, almost humming now with a kind of quiet potential. They sat without urgency, legs crossed, one hand resting on their knee, the other loosely draped over the edge of the bench, fingers barely grazing the worn wood. You wonder whether they were waiting for something, or if they were simply comfortable with the kind of waiting that never really needed to end. Around you, the land breathed slowly, and the sky above held that same stillness, its pale light giving no hint of time's passing, as if the sun had chosen to hold its position out of respect for whatever was unfolding below. You tilted your head back just slightly, enough to let your eyes take in the sweeping expanse of the horizon. There was no movement in the distance now, no more approaching figures or drifting clouds or trails of dust. Just a vast, silent stretch of land that lay like a blanket, heavy with memory and soft with age. The kind of place that didn't need to prove itself to be real. It simply was. Without turning to face you, the stranger spoke again, voice low and worn, like pages turning a book long forgotten but never discarded. "Do you know what this place is?" They asked, not as a test, not even as a true question, but as a thread, offered gently for you to hold on to if you wished. You thought for a moment before answering, not because you didn't have words, but because they all felt too heavy, too sharp for the softness of the air around you. "No," you said, finally, your voice as slow as theirs, "but I don't think that matters." The stranger nodded once, barely perceptibly, as if your response had confirmed something they already knew, or perhaps something they had only hoped. "Some call it a crossing," they murmured. "Some call it a resting place. Others say it's where stories go when no one remembers how they end." You let the words settle around you, soaking into the warmth of the bench and the quiet of the grass. A resting place, a crossing, a story unended. Each description rang true in its own way, though none of them seemed complete. You had the strange sense that this place might be all of them at once, or something else entirely, something that could only be understood in the spaces between words. "It's peaceful," you said, more to yourself than to your companion. "Ain't it?" They replied, a faint smile in their tone. Most folks fight at first, try to make sense of it, try to remember what came before, try to figure where they're headed. But the longer you stay, the less any of that matters. You glance sideways at them. "Have you been here long?" They exhaled through their nose, the sound barely more than a sigh. "Long enough to stop counting," they said, and maybe long enough to know that counting wouldn't make a difference anyway. You nodded, and silence returned, comfortable and vast. The tree above rustled again, a soft whispering sound, as though it were gently agreeing with everything that had just been said. After a while, you leaned forward slightly, elbows on your knees, fingers interlaced. "So, what happens now?" You asked not with fear, but with a kind of quiet curiosity, like someone asking in a bedtime story just before falling asleep. The stranger was quiet for a long time. Then they said, "That depends." Some folks stay here. They walk the same paths, sit at the same tables, listen to the same songs. And that's enough. Others, they trailed off, reaching down to tap the case beside them gently. Others still have something to carry. Some thread left to tie off. Some tune left to play. You look down at the case. Its leather dark and worn, its edges soft from years of being lifted, placed, carried, set down again. What's in there? You asked, your voice almost playful. The stranger didn't answer right away. They turned toward you fully for the first time, eyes meeting yours directly. Pale, thoughtful, but not piercing. They weren't trying to read you or judge you. They were simply seeing you, the way someone might look at a painting that's unfamiliar, but still beautiful, still whole. Something old, they said finally, and something mine. You looked away, not because the gaze was too intense, but because something in it made you feel very still inside, as though a part of you had been recognized before you even knew it was there. A breeze passed again, stirring the grass in the valley below, and somewhere far off, the faint crackle would echo across the land. Perhaps a door closing or a branch giving way. It didn't startle you. If anything, it felt like punctuation, like a gentle reminder that even silence had its own rhythm. The stranger stood, then, slow and smooth, as if gravity had to be asked for permission. They stretched just slightly, lifting the case over their shoulder with a single practice motion, and looked down at you with a warmth that was neither expectation nor farewell. You don't have to follow, they said, but if you do, the road's still waiting. You remained seated for a few long heartbeats, feeling the wood beneath you, the tree at your back, the dust in the folds of your clothes. Then you stood, too, not because you knew where you were going, but because your feet were already ready to move, as though they had only been resting until the next moment began. The two of you stood there together beneath the tree, side by side, the sun behind you casting long shadows across the bench in the road and the grasses below. No one spoke again. There was nothing left to explain. And when you finally took that first step, following the stranger as they moved slowly back toward the heart of the land, toward whatever lay beyond the edge of the valley and the edge of the maps, the wind rose behind you, not with force, but with encouragement, lifting a faint swirl of dust into the air, like a path being sketched lightly before your feet. The town behind you faded gently into the stillness, its shutters soft, its doors resting, its piano silent once more. The path unfolded before you not as something carved into the earth with certainty and permanence, but as a soft suggestion of movement, a meandering ribbon of space between tufts of golden grass and the scattered remains of old wooden posts that leaned like tired sentinels long past their duty. Each step you took beside the stranger was accompanied by the gentle swish of boots brushing against dry blades, the faint scuff of dust rising and falling again in the lazy rhythm of someone with no place to rush toward. The world around you remained hushed, not silent, not still, but deeply, peacefully quiet, as though the land itself had been waiting for your footsteps to begin once more. The wind seemed to shift with you, its current now flowing in the direction you walked, slipping past your face with a softness of sigh, tugging lightly at your coat as if urging you on, not out of urgency, but like a friend quietly encouraging you to keep going, even if you didn't yet know where the road might lead. You glanced once at the stranger walking just ahead of you, the long case swinging gently across their back, the brim of their hat still low, the outline of their body casting a narrow, calm shadow in the muted light. They walked with that same easy grace, not fast, not slow, just steady, as if they too were being carried more by the moment than by intention. The land stretched out wide around you, rolling and low, smooth hills that dipped and rose like the soft folds of an old, worn quilt. There were no landmarks now, no buildings, no fences, no wells or windmills, only the unbroken expanse of sun-warmed grass and the occasional gnarled tree clinging to the horizon. It felt like walking to the memory of something, a place half remembered from a dream or a story told long ago, its details softened by time until only the feeling remained, warm, quiet, spacious, and safe. As you walked, a question formed slowly in the back of your mind. Not a sharp question, not one born of confusion or fear, but the kind that drifted forward like a leaf on still water, turning slowly in the current until it reached the surface. Has anyone ever reached the end of this place? You asked, your voice low and even more like a thought spoken aloud than a request for an answer. The stranger didn't turn around, didn't stop walking, but you saw their head tilt just slightly, as if acknowledging both the question and the place it came from. Depends on what you mean by end, they replied after a pause, their voice carrying easily in the open air, as if the wind had offered to carry it for them. Some say there's a river, far out past the last ridge, so wide and quiet it mirrors the sky. Others talk about a town made of light, where no shadows fall. But I think they paused, as though considering whether to say more. I think the end isn't something you reach. It's something you recognize. You walked in silence for a moment, letting those words sink in. There was a kind of comfort in them, a gentleness that asked nothing from you but presence, the willingness to continue placing one foot in front of the other. You didn't need to know where you were going, only that you were going, and that was enough for now. Eventually, the path turned slightly, not sharply, but with a natural curve that followed the bend of a dry creek bed, now filled with grass and scattered stones. You stepped carefully, your boots brushing over smooth pebbles and cracked earth, and as you climbed the gentle slope on the other side, a new sight came into view, a tall, thin structure standing alone on a hilltop, silhouetted against the pale sky. It looked like a tower, but too narrow for people to live in, and as you drew closer, you saw that it wasn't made of wood or stone, but of iron, rusted, silent, latticed with thin metal beams that reached upward like the bones of a forgotten machine. The stranger paused at the base of the hill and looked up at the structure. An old telegraph tower, they said softly, hasn't worked in years. No wires left to carry words, but it still listens. You stepped forward, drawn by the strange elegance of the thing, its fragile lines cutting into the light. Up close, it looked almost delicate, like it could be toppled by a strong wind, yet something about it felt deeply grounded, rooted in more than the soil beneath it. You reached out and touched with the beams, and the metal felt warm, not from the sun, but from age, like it had absorbed 1,000 unspoken messages over the years, and was still holding them gently inside. What did it used to say? You asked, your fingers trailing slowly along the rusted edge. The stranger gave a quiet chuckle, the sound dry and kind. All kinds of things. News, warnings, letters from folks too far to ride. But mostly, I think it was just people trying not to feel so alone. You stood there a while longer, letting your hand rest against the old iron, your eyes tracing the sky through the gaps in the beams. A bird flew overhead, small and dark, its wings still in the air like it had no need to flap. It glided past the tower without sound, disappearing behind a fold in the land, and the wind followed after it, tugging at your collar once again. The stranger stepped forward, placing one hand on the base of the tower in a gesture that felt almost like a farewell. We should keep going, they said, not firmly, not impatiently, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew that staying still too long might cause the world to forget you were ever moving. You nodded and stepped away from the tower, casting one last glance at its crooked frame before following your companion down the far side of the hill. The land stretched wider here, more open, the sky above now tinged faintly with gold, though the sun remained high and still, unmoved in its place. Your footsteps joined theirs once more, and together you walked across the plain, the grass parting before you and closing gently behind, as if the world were content to let you pass through, without resistance, without question, only with a quiet promise that wherever you were headed, something would be there, waiting. The land you walked upon no longer felt like ground in the ordinary sense. It had taken on the texture of memory, soft and sprawling, like pages worn smooth by endless fingertips, or the inside of a coat collar shaped by years of wear. Each step you took no longer seemed to carry you forward through space alone, but rather inward, deeper into a quiet truth that had waited too long to be heard. The grass whispered around your ankles, parted without protest as your boots passed through it, and the wind moved steadily alongside you now, not ahead, not behind, but as a companion, rustling gently in the fold of your coat and lifting the edges of your thoughts with a calm, steady hand. The stranger walked just ahead, still and steady, as if they had always known this way, though the road remained invisible. No signs, no markers, no turns, just the rhythm of motion, a path borne only by the willingness to keep placing one foot in front of the other. The sky above deepened imperceptibly in color, the faintest golden hue settling along the edges of the light, Not enough to call it dusk, but enough to make the day feel like it had exhaled. Still, the sun did not move, and no shadows stretched longer than they already were. Time remained diffused, as soft as a breeze, as weightless as the dust that stirred around your steps. You began to notice the silence again, not empty, but full. It had shape and tone and warmth. The kind of silence that presses lightly on your skin and settles into your bones, not with threat, but with invitation. It was a hush of libraries, the stillness of chapels, the sound a room makes when someone you love has just left it. Presence turned inside out. It hung in the air like a quilt, and it wrapped itself gently around the two of you as you moved farther into the openness, away from whatever town or tower had once marked your beginning. It was then, as the wind turned slightly and brought with it the scent of something faint and unfamiliar, distant wood smoke, maybe, or sage crushed beneath a heel, that the strangers slowed their pace. You matched their rhythm instinctively, falling into step just behind, your boots making the same soft thud against the dry earth. They raised one hand slightly, palm open, as though catching the wind itself, feeling its message through the space between their fingers. "We're close," they said, and though you didn't know what to, you nodded, understanding not the meaning of the words, but the weight behind them. Close did not mean near in distance. It meant near in readiness. Something just ahead was waiting to be seen, or remembered, or perhaps simply acknowledged. You crested a low hill then, small, gentle, its rise barely more than a ripple in the earth. And on the other side, nestled in a shallow dip where the wind moved slow and the grass grew taller, was a clearing. It held no buildings, no ruins, no signs of life, yet it pulsed with presence. A ring of stones lay at its center, worn smooth, arranged in a perfect circle, each one resting in the soil as though it had always belonged there. Some were dark, others pale, a few flecked with lichen or marked with cracks, but together they formed a shape so natural, so complete, that you almost didn't notice it at first. It looked like something the land had made for itself. The stranger stepped into the ring without hesitation, moving to its center with the ease of someone returning to a familiar place. They unslung the leather case from their shoulder and knelt slowly, setting it down before them with a reverence that felt ceremonial but not performative. You stood just outside the circle, watching, not from fear or caution, but because something in the air told you this was a moment best observed in stillness. They opened the case with slow, practiced movements. The latches gave a soft click, the flap folding back with a faint creak of old leather. Inside, nestled in cloth that had faded to the color of old parchment, was a long, narrow instrument. Not a gun, not a tool, but something stranger. It looked like a cross between a violin and a rifle, with a slender neck and a long, hollow body carved with intricate patterns, swirls and symbols that shimmered faintly in the fading light. It was unlike anything you had ever seen, and yet, impossibly, it felt familiar, as if you'd once dreamed of it or seen it in the corner of an old painting. The stranger lifted it gently, cradling it in their hands like something fragile and deeply loved. They turned slightly, so you could see their face more clearly, and there, for the first time, you saw something shift. Not a smile, not a frown, something softer. A loosening of the jaw, a quiet in the eyes, the look of someone finally arriving where they'd always meant to be. Without a word, they placed the instrument against their shoulder and began to play. The sound that emerged was not sharp or bright. It was low and warm, a kind of hum that sank into the earth and rose into the sky all at once. It moved through the circle of stones like smoke, curling in the air, brushing past your cheeks, wrapping around your heart with a tenderness that made your chest ache in the sweetest way. It was not a song in the way most people think of songs. No melody you could hum, no rhythm you could tap your foot to, but it was music all the same. Music that spoke not in notes, but in memory. Music that pulled at something deep inside you, something old and sleeping. As the stranger played, the world around you seemed to breathe more deeply. The grass swayed in rhythm. The wind quieted and the sun, though still unmoving, glowed just a shade warmer, as if listening. You closed your eyes for a moment, letting the sound carry you, and in that instant you felt it. Not just the present, but the past. Moments rising from the dust. Laughter and footsteps. Campfires and quiet tears. Hands clasped. Names whispered. All of it moving through you like a gentle river, not overwhelming but complete. You opened your eyes again and saw the stranger still playing, the instrument held steady, their fingers moving with slow certainty. Around the circle, the stone shimmered faintly now, not glowing, not sparking, just humming softly with light, as if warmed from within by the song. And somewhere deep inside you, something let go, a knot you hadn't known you were carrying, a weight you'd forgotten was there. You took a step closer, not into the circle yet, but to its edge, where the grass was tallest and the earth was warmest, and there you stood, listening, breathing, feeling the quiet change not around you, but within you. And the music played on. The music wound itself around you like a slow-moving tide, not crashing or overwhelming, but curling gently at your feet, rising in warm, deliberate waves that carried the weight of stories too old for words and too tender for memory. It wrapped around your chest and threaded softly through your hair, filled the hollows of your ribs, settled in the bend of your elbows and behind your knees, until your whole body felt not so much held as remembered. There was something in it that spoke to more than just your ears, a language older than speech, older even in thought, that reached past the borders of identity and into the open field of being itself. You stood motionless at the edge of the circle, one foot brushing lightly against the tall grass, your breath slow and shallow, not for fear, but because the music left no room for haste. Inside the ring of stones, the stranger played on the odd, elegant instrument cradled against their shoulder, its dark wood glinting in the soft amber light that seemed to rise from the ground rather than fall from the sky. Their fingers moved with the ease of someone who had played this melody before, perhaps not in this exact shape, but in others like it, in different seasons, under different skies, in front of people who no longer had names. There was no showiness to their playing, no performance, no flourish, just quiet, measured devotion, as though every note were a prayer to something that did not require praise, only presence. The stones themselves seemed to hum in response, faint vibrations running to their weathered surfaces, joining the song without disrupting it. It was as if the music had always belonged here, always waited to be played again in this very clearing, and the land had merely paused its breath until the bow met the strings once more. Above, the sky deepened slightly in color, not darkening, not dimming, but becoming richer, like a painting with another layer of glaze. The gold was warmer now, tinged with something like rose or rust, as though the day had finally chosen to begin its quiet descent toward night. You watched the stranger's face, calm and focused, their eyes not open but not closed either, gazing inward, perhaps towards some place that required no landmarks. And as you stood there, you began to feel a tug, gentle and slow, from within your own chest. Not pain, not yearning, just a quiet movement, like a door inside you beginning to open, a door you hadn't known was there. Behind it, not memory, but something simpler, images without names, impressions without chronology, a fire lit beside a creek, a hand resting on another's back, the creak of a saddle, a field full of wildflowers, the scent of rain on dust. These moments rose and fell with the music, not flashing or vivid, but softened by distance and comfort, as though they belonged not to your past, but to your soul. You took another step forward. This time, the grass parted more easily and the wind, instead of pushing gently against you, circled behind like a companion, nudging you onward. You crossed into the circle without ceremony, without resistance, your boots brushing softly against the edge of one of the stones. The moment you entered, the sound of the instrument changed, not in melody, not in tone, but in feel. It was as if a missing harmony had returned, a piece of the puzzle clicking quietly into place. The stranger did not look up, did not pause their playing, but a subtle shift in their posture told you they knew you were there, that your presence was expected, welcomed, even necessary. You stood there for a long time, or maybe it was only a moment, stretched out in the way dreams tend to be, listening to the music within the ring, feeling its notes settle deeper into you now, tracing old paths through your limbs and bones, reminding you of how it felt to be part of something without needing to define it. You looked down at your hands and found them relaxed, your fingers no longer curled tightly but open, soft, as if ready to hold something, or perhaps ready to release. Then, slowly, the music began to fade, not abruptly, not like a curtain falling or a switch flipped, but gently, like a breeze growing still or a candle flickering low. Each note carried a little farther than the last, like the final words of farewell spoken with warmth and peace. The stranger drew the bow across the strings one last time, a long, trembling breath of sound, and then lowered the instrument with quiet reverence, laying it once more across the folded cloth inside the case. You did not speak. You did not need to. The moment spoke for both of you. The stranger sat back slightly on their heels, resting their hands on their knees, eyes still distant, but now softened further, like a reflection seen in water just before sunset. It's always different, they said at last, voice barely more than a whisper, but always ends the same, not with answers, with quiet. You nodded, and the gesture felt less like agreement and more like surrender, not in defeat but in understanding. The kind of surrender that comes when you stop trying to hold back the tide, when you let the water carry you, because it knows the way. The wind stirred again, lifting a few strands of your hair and sending them dancing across your cheek. Around you, the stones pulsed faintly once more, their light dimming, not extinguished, but easing into a kind of rest. You knelt slowly beside the stranger, mirroring their posture without thought, your hands resting in your lap, your knees pressed gently to the warm soil. For a time, you sat together in silence. And in that silence, something shifted, not in the land, not in the sky, but in you. A tension released, so subtle you hadn't known it was there. A breath you hadn't realized you'd been holding, now exhale fully. The world did not change in that moment. But you did. When the stranger finally rose, they did so with no urgency, no signal. You followed, not because you were told to, but because it was time. The case was closed again, slung over their back with practiced ease, and together you stepped once more beyond the ring of stones, leaving them to rest as they had for years, perhaps decades, perhaps lifetimes. And behind you, the clearing faded not into distance, but into memory. The ground beneath your boots felt warmer now, as though the circle of stones had passed some quiet heat into your soles, not in temperature but in memory, a softness that remained even after you stepped beyond it, like the last trace of sunlight lingering on your shoulders long after dusk. The grass moved with a hush around your knees, parting easily with your steps, whispering faint sound that seemed less like noise and more like breath. Long, even exhales from a land that had spent its lifetime learning the art of patience. You didn't speak. Neither did the stranger. But the silence between you had changed, deepened, grown richer, not like a void, but like a space now filled with shared understanding, the kind that didn't require words and would have only been diminished by them. Behind you, the stone circle faded from view, not abruptly, not with the finality of a door closed or a page turned, but with the soft quiet of something complete. It didn't vanish so much as sink gently into the folds of the land, like a song ending just as it should, with no need for applause, only stillness. And you did not feel the need to look back. It wasn't being forgotten. It was simply part of you now. Ahead, the land stretched open again, but not in the same way it had before. There was a subtle shift in the texture of the world, as if the air itself had grown slightly thicker, not heavier, but more saturated, like the atmosphere just before rain, full of quiet promise. The hills rolled gently on, but the color of the grass seemed just a shade deeper, the sky above just a degree more golden, and the wind carried with a tone that felt like music heard from far away. You walked not toward a destination, but within a moment that had no edges, no urgency, and no need be anything more than it already was. The stranger led you along a path that hadn't been visible until you were already walking it, barely more than a subtle line where the grass grew a little shorter, where the dust lay a little flatter, where the ground remembered the shape of footsteps long since past. It was a kind of trail that seemed to emerge only when needed, like a thought rising to the surface just when it's ready to be known. Eventually, you began to notice shapes rising in the distance, not large, not looming, but soft silhouettes resting gently on the horizon. As you drew closer, their forms became clearer. Small buildings, low fences, scattered tools. A homestead, perhaps a place that had once been filled with movement, now lying still, not abandoned but at rest. The wood of the structures had faded into that warm silver gray that only time can paint, each board and beam warped slightly with age, yet still sturdy. still holding fast against a long stretch of silence. The windows were open but empty, and the doors stood ajar, not as signs of neglect, but as invitations, gentle acknowledgments that there was nothing here to steal and nothing to fear. You paused at the edge of the clearing, letting your eyes drift across the quiet scene. A windmill stood off to the side, its blades barely turning in the breeze, their slow rotation more ritual than function. Nearby, a rocking chair sat on a porch, swaying ever so slightly, though no one occupied it, and across from it, a watering trough, half-filled, reflected the pale gold of the sky in slow ripples, disturbed only by the touch of the wind. The stranger stopped beside you and let their gaze settle on the homestead, without expression, not nostalgic, not sad, just still. This is where I started, they said quietly, almost as if speaking to the wind rather than to you. Or maybe where I stopped. Hard to tell the difference out here. You turned to look at them, but they didn't return your gaze. Their eyes remained on the buildings, as if trying to read something written in their silence. You followed their gaze, and as you did, a wave of something soft and heavy rose in your chest. Not sorrow, not joy, but that middle place where feeling lives before it picks a name. Does it ever change? You asked, unsure what you meant, but needing to speak the words just the same. The stranger gave a slow breath. Only if it needs to. You stood there a while longer, watching the slow sway of the windmill, the gentle flicker of a curtain in a high window, the way the porch steps had sagged just slightly over the years. You didn't feel the need to go inside. You didn't feel the need to ask what had happened here. The homestead didn't ask to be known. It asked only to be seen. Eventually, the stranger stepped forward, moving across the clearing with the same steady gait they'd had since you first met. You followed, your steps quiet against the dry earth, your breath slow and steady. They led you not to the house, but to the space behind it, a wide, open stretch of land where the fence posts had mostly fallen, and the grass had grown wild. In the center of it stood a single tree, small and crooked, its branches reaching outward rather than up, as though trying to hold something rather than touch the sky. Beneath it, a stone, small, flat, unmarked. The stranger knelt beside it, one hand resting gently on the surface, fingers brushing away a few scattered leaves. Used to be, they said, I thought I had to leave something behind here, thought I had to bury something before I could keep going. But I don't think that's true anymore. You stepped closer, letting the tree's shadow fall across your boots. The air here felt different, denser, perhaps, or more still. The kind of stillness that asks nothing of you but presence. The stranger stood again and looked up at the branches, the bare fingers of the tree dancing lightly in the breeze, casting lace-like patterns on the ground. You can rest here if you want, they said softly, or you can keep walking. The land doesn't mind either way. You looked at the stone, at the tree, at the wide open space around you. You thought of the music, of the circle, of the wind, of the quiet town and the silent tower. And you realized that wherever you chose to go next, it would not be because you were lost or because you were searching. It would be because you were ready. And for the first time, you truly were. The crooked tree behind the house swayed only slightly, its thin branches rustling in a rhythm too subtle to follow, more like a memory being stirred than a breeze being felt. Its bark, dry and sun-bleached, bore the quiet confidence of something that had seen too many seasons to count. Each ring tucked safely inside like chapters in a book that no one else would ever read. The flat stone beneath it, though small and unmarked, radiated a presence that anchored the space around it, not through grandeur or ceremony, but through stillness. The kind of stillness that didn't ask to be noticed, but couldn't be ignored once you stepped into its shade. You found yourself sitting beside it without realizing you'd made the decision. One moment standing, the next with your legs folded beneath you, your hands resting loosely on your thighs, palms open, as though something inside you had chosen rest before your mind could weigh the choice. The stranger sat a few feet away, not too near, not too far, their back to the tree trunk, their hat tilted forward just enough to shade their eyes. For a time, neither of you spoke, not for lack of words, but because silence had become a language of its own, a kind of slow, invisible conversation between the land and your breath, between the dust in the air and the thoughts that now drifted so slowly through your mind they no longer needed to be named. Above, the sky had settled into a color that defied description. Somewhere between gold and silver, between warm and cool, a color that seemed to hum rather than shine. The sun remained pinned in that impossible place overhead, never moving, never hurrying, content simply to glow. There were no shadows to chase you forward, no fading light to pull you along. Time in this place had unspooled like thread from a forgotten spool, loose and gentle, free from the tension of schedules or endings. Your fingers traced the earth beside the stone, feeling the soft press of dry grass and the occasional curve of a pebble. Everything felt textured here, not rough, not sharp, just real, as if the land itself were offering its hand, reminding you that you were allowed to feel things slowly, fully, without the need to define or defend them. You breathed in through your nose, and the scent of the place settled in your chest like an old song, dust, wind, cedar, and something older still, something you couldn't quite place, like the echo of rain on canvas or the smell of smoke lingering on a wool coat long after the fire had gone out. You ever get the feeling, the stranger said softly, breaking the silence without disturbing it, that you've been here before? Not this exact place, but this kind of moment. You didn't answer right away. You let the question sit there, like a stone dropped in water, watching the ripples move outward. Then, slowly, you nodded. It feels like a dream I forgot, you said, your voice quiet and sure, but one that's been waiting. The stranger smiled faintly, the corners of their mouth barely lifting. That's how I knew I wasn't lost when I first got here. It didn't feel like a new place. It felt like a return. You turned your eyes back to the stone, its surface mottled with lichen, cracked in places but whole. Did you leave something here? You asked, not out of curiosity, but because the question seemed to float up on its own, weightless and gentle. The stranger was quiet for a while. Then, no, not really. I used to think I had to. Thought, that's what this place was about, leaving things behind. But now I think it's more about what you're ready to carry. You looked down at your own hands again, palms open, the creases in your skin filled with a fine dust that felt almost like flour, soft and clinging. You flexed your fingers slowly, watching the way the light caught the tiny grains. You thought about what you had brought with you to this place. Not objects, not baggage, but feelings, fragments of memory, echoes of voices, moments that never quite finished. And here, for the first time, none of it felt too heavy. It just was accepted, seen. A breeze stirred again, and somewhere off to the right, you heard the soft creak of the windmill turning, its slow rotations a kind of lullaby for the sky. A hawk passed overhead, silent and unhurried, its wings stretched wide, gliding on invisible currents that seemed to rise from the land itself. You followed its path with your eyes, watching it disappear behind a low hill, and then returned your gaze to the tree, to the stone, to the ground. And in that moment, you understood something. Not in words, not in logic, but in the way a scent can remind you of someone long gone, or the way a song can take you back to a room that no longer exists. You understood that this place, this clearing, this stone, was not about letting go. It was about being still enough to remember what had always been there, not to escape it, not to change it, but to sit beside it, to listen to it breathe. The stranger shifted slightly beside you, their coat brushing against the bark of the tree, their hands now folded loosely in their lap. Most folks who find their way here, they said, think they have to choose something, stay or go, forget or remember. But truth is, you don't have to pick. You just have to be willing to listen. You nodded again, and the motion felt like more than agreement. It felt like acknowledgement. You didn't need to decide anything. Not yet. Maybe not ever. You just needed to sit here, under this tree, beside the stranger, beside the stone, and let the quiet of the world fold itself around you like a soft blanket. The wind blew once more, stronger now, but not cold. It circled the clearing and rustled the tall grass beyond the house, kicked up a few motes of dust that danced in the golden air, then settled again, as if exhaling. The house stood still, and the sky held steady, and you, sitting there in the shade, felt something inside you settle too. Not finish, not resolve, just settle. And maybe that was enough. The stillness beneath the crooked tree had become a kind of place unto itself, a space outside of movement, outside of the world's turning. like a hidden room within time where the dust settled slowly and the light draped itself softly over every surface, untouched by haste or worry. You remained seated beside the stone, the earth pressed gently against your legs, the breeze weaving in and out of your breath as if it too had decided to rest for a while. The stranger was quiet again, their presence as steady and unintrusive as a rock warmed by the sun. They didn't fidget, didn't glance toward the horizon or check the light. It was as if they had spent so long walking that stillness had become its own kind of journey. Somewhere nearby, a bird let out a long, low call, not urgent, not bright, but thick and slow, as if drawn out from the throat of the sky. Its sound hung there for a moment, suspended in the warm air, before being carried off by the wind that curled through the grass. You listened, not with the intent to interpret or follow, but the way one listens to a fire crackling or water lapping against a shore, just letting the sound find you, pass through you, and go on its way. And as the wind circled once again and returned from the other side, something shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, but subtle and deep, like a stone at the bottom of a pond turning just enough to change the pattern of the ripples. It wasn't something you could see or name, but you felt it in the way your spine lengthened slightly, in the way your fingers uncurled, in the way your lungs expanded, as if you'd been holding them shallow without knowing. The land was changing, not in shape or size, but in meaning. What had been still was now ready to move again. The stranger reached up slowly and tilted their hat back just far enough to let the full light of the sky touch their face. It was the first time you truly saw them, not just their outline, not just the way they moved, but their whole expression. Their skin was lined and wind-worn, not from age, but from time spent beneath skies with no roofs. Their eyes held something ancient and kind, something that didn't sparkle, but glowed quietly, like embers that never go out. And their mouth was soft, curved into that same faint smile that had never quite left, the kind of smile worn by those who had stopped chasing understanding and started walking beside it instead. They looked at you for a moment, not to study or assess, but to see. And in that gaze, you felt no pressure to speak, no weight to explain who you were or what had brought you here. It was a look of someone who recognized you not from your past, but from your presence. "Ready?" they asked, the word no louder than the rustling leaves, but carrying the weight of 1,000 choices made without words. You looked around once more. The stone was still there, cool and steady. The tree still leaned slightly to the side, as if listening. The house remained behind you, still open, still undemanding. Everything was as it had been, but something inside you had changed. Not finished, not resolved, just moved. You nodded. The stranger stood, brushing dust from their coat with one slow swipe, then offered their hand, not to pull you up, but simply to steady the moment. You took it, and the warmth of their palm met yours with a quiet firmness. When you stood, the grass at your knees slid away like water, and your boots found the earth again with a sense of return rather than departure. Together, you began walking once more, not back toward the house, not toward the windmill or the fence line, but at an angle that led into the open hills, where the horizon was wide and the sky leaned down to touch the tops of the grass. There was no path, no trail, but your feet knew where to fall, and the wind moved with you now, not behind, not ahead, but among you, like a quiet third traveler with no name and no need for one. The sky shifted too, just slightly, a soft deepening of tone, as though it was beginning to consider the idea of dusk. Not yet, but soon. The sun had finally begun its descent, subtle and slow, the light stretching just a little longer across the land, turning the grass into rivers of soft gold and the distant hills into silhouettes. Shadows began to appear again, faint at first, then stronger, each one cast long and thin behind your steps. But they didn't feel ominous. They felt honest. The kind of shadows that only come when light is finally moving again. As you walked, the world grew quieter, not because it was empty, but because it was listening. The birds had stilled, the insects had hushed, even the distant breeze had fallen into step with your rhythm. The only sound was your footsteps and the soft brush of the stranger's coat, and even those sounds seemed designed not to disturb, but to blend with the peace around them. Then, just over the next rise, you saw something unexpected, a fire, small, contained, flickering gently inside a ring of stones much like the ones back at the tree. And around it, for shapes. Figures seated low, relaxed, each one facing the flames. They did not speak. They did not move, but they were not surprised by your presence. As you and the stranger approached, none of them looked up in alarm. One simply nodded once. Another raised a hand slowly, palm open, in a gesture of welcome, so quiet it might have been mistaken for part of the wind. The stranger turned slightly toward you. "It's a place to stop," they said. "Not an ending, just a place to be." You hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but because something about this felt like a moment you didn't want to rush. Then you nodded again, and together you stepped into the circle, the fire warming your face, its glow reaching your fingers, your chest, your feet. You lowered yourself to the ground beside the others, who made room without words, as though your arrival had been long expected. The stranger took their place opposite you, the light catching their eyes, reflecting the flicker of the flames. No one spoke. No one needed to. The fire did all the talking. Soft pops and crackles, the whisper of flame touching wood, the occasional sigh of ash shifting in the heat. And there, under the open sky, with strangers who felt like echoes of something familiar, with the land quiet all around and the warmth of the fire settling into your bones, you let yourself begin to rest again. Not sleep yet, but rest. The kind of rest that comes after long walking. The kind that holds you gently. The kind that waits. The fire didn't burn high, nor did it sputter or snap as fires often do when fed with dry wood and restless hands. It simply glowed, quietly, steadily, its warmth unfolding and wide, even pulses that matched the rhythm of your own breath. The flame swayed slightly with the breeze, not fighting it, but moving with it, as if both were part of the same conversation. The others around the fire didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't glance about nervously as strangers often do when sitting in silence. They were simply present, each one seated with an ease that suggested they'd been there for some time, perhaps for hours, perhaps for years. It was impossible to tell. They were neither old nor young, neither expectant nor finished. They were just still. You sat close to flames now, cross-legged, your hands resting loosely on your knees, and for the first time since waking in this strange, quiet world, your body felt entirely your own, unburdened, unhurried, and perfectly settled into the moment. The dust on your boots, the creases in your clothes, the looseness in your joints after a long walk across gently shifting terrain. None of it felt uncomfortable. It all simply belonged, as much as the fire would belong to the ring of stones or the stars belonged above the thinning sky. Someone shifted beside you, not to move away, not to interrupt, but just to ease their leg or adjust their coat, and the sound of the movement blended with the fire, like another instrument joining the quietest of orchestras. The stranger who had walked beside you sat across the flames, their silhouette soft against the deepening horizon. Their hat was still pulled low, the familiar tilt casting a half-shadow over their face. But even in that shadow, you could see the same sense of peace that had followed them since the beginning. If they noticed you watching, they didn't show it. Or maybe they did, in the way they rested a hand against the ground, steady and sure, like they were anchoring you back into the moment. The firelight didn't dance the way it usually does. Instead, it pulsed, faintly, rhythmically, as though it was breathing with you. Inhale, flicker. Exhale, glow. The shadows it cast weren't sharp or flickering, but soft-edged, curling gently against the earth, wrapping the circle in warmth and hush. Above, the sky had dipped another shade deeper. Not fully night, not yet, but no longer day. The colors were hushed now, dusty plum, deep gold, fading copper, as if the heavens had tired of brightness and chosen instead to dim the lights one by one. Like a room preparing for sleep, your eyes moved slowly over the faces of the others by the fire, though face might not be the right word for what you saw. They had features, yes, eyes, mouth, skin, but they were not entirely fixed. The glow of the fire shifted them softly, subtly, and each time you looked away and back again, they seemed a little different. Not in a startling way, but in the way dreams alter familiar just enough to make it new. One wore a wide scarf, thick and frayed, and their hands were callous and brown from sun and work. Another had long hair tucked into a low braid that reached their chest, the ends of it catching firelight like threads of gold. A third sat quietly with arms folded across their knees, their boots worn down to heels, their coat patched in places with fabric that did not match. You didn't ask who they were. Somehow, you already knew that wasn't necessary. One of them turned slightly toward you, not with a question, but with a kind of invitation. Their eyes met yours for a moment, and though no words passed between you, something did. A recognition, not of identity, but of presence. You've walked different paths, yes, but all those paths had led here, to this fire on this stretch of land, beneath the sky that did not rush. And in that single glance, you felt understood, not known, not judged, not analyzed, just seen. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a small gust of sparks, each one rising like a slow constellation before fading into the dusk. The sound it made was like the sigh of an old door swinging open, and in the space that followed, the stranger across the fire finally spoke. Some people only pass through here, they said, their voice soft and steady, not raised above the hush, but perfectly clear within it. Others stay a while, long enough to remember what they didn't know they'd forgotten. You didn't respond. Not yet. But the words settled into you like a stone dropped gently into water, spreading their presence outward, rippling through places you hadn't yet explored. You thought of the town you'd seen at the beginning, the silent tower, the dusty streets. You thought of the soundless bell, the wind in the dry grass, the circle of stones. You thought of your own footsteps echoing across an empty floor, and of the stranger's voice weaving music into the open air. None of it felt far away now. None of it felt disjointed. It had all happened in a way that made sense not in time, but in rhythm, one breath following another. You looked again into the fire, and for a moment, the flames seemed to change. Shapes flickered within them. Not terrifying, not mystical, just familiar. A horse trotting slowly across a field. A pair of hands braiding rope. The tilt of a hat in a dust storm. A figure washing their face in the cool water of a river. Moments not from your own life, but from a life you recognized all the same. Not ghosts, not memories, just echoes. Faint, soft echoes of the world as it was. Or perhaps as it still is, somewhere beneath the surface of all things. You felt your eyes grow heavier, not with fatigue, but with release. The kind of weight that comes when something inside you has stopped bracing itself. A loosening, a softening. Around the fire, no one stirred, but you sensed the circle breathing as one now, each body attuned to the same quiet frequency. It was as if the world had pulled in close around you, not to trap, but to hold. Your hand drifted toward the earth beside you, fingers curling into the dust, not grasping, just making contact. And as you sat there, with firelight warming your cheeks and the gentle hush of the land settling deeper into your bones, you realized you were no longer wondering when this dream would end, because it no longer felt like a dream. It felt like home. The fire continued its slow breathing beside you, never loud, never demanding, just gently alive, as if its only purpose was to offer comfort in the dark, and to remind you that warmth did not always have to come from movement. Around it, the others remained seated, their limbs folded loosely, their gazes shifting now and then toward the flames of the fading horizon, but no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because saying out loud might have made it too small. The language here had changed, become quieter, more internal, and you realized that conversation no longer required voices. That understanding had settled into something older and deeper than speech. You leaned slightly forward, not to rise, not to shift, but simply to draw your hands closer to the warmth. Your fingers hovered just above the glowing embers, feeling their steady pulse echo in the soft skin of your palms. You traced a slow circle in the dust, not thinking, not drawing, just moving, and the motion soothed you in a way that surprised you. Like a gesture remembered from childhood, the absent rhythm of fingers on earth bringing back something wordless and deep. The dust curled beneath your touch, fine and cool, catching the light of the fire and turning golden just at the edges, as though the earth itself were stitched with sparks. The sky above had deepened into something just shy of true night. Not yet starry, but dim enough that the blue had surrendered its brightness and blended into shadow. The sun was gone, but its memory still clung to the edges of the hills, like a lantern that had been carried just out of sight, its glow lingering behind as a kind of farewell. The shadows around you grew longer now, stretching gently away from the fire, not sharp or eerie, but soft and slow-moving, as if time itself had lengthened its stride, deciding to walk with you instead of ahead of you. The stranger across the fire shifted only slightly, the edge of their coat catching the firelight for a moment before falling back into shade. Their hat remained tilted, but their presence was no longer mysterious. It was familiar now, like the outline of a mountain you've seen from afar all your life, but have only now come close enough to touch. They glanced toward you, not directly, just enough to acknowledge that the silence between you had matured, not grown heavier, but deeper, like a well whose bottom you'd stopped trying to find. And then, almost imperceptibly, someone else in the circle began to hum. It wasn't a tune. Not really. Just a low, steady note, barely more than a breath shaped into sound. It flowed across the fire like mist across a still pond, quiet and smooth, without beginning or end. Another joined it, a second voice weaving in and out of first, neither dominant nor echo, just partners in sound. The others followed, slowly, softly, until the fire was surrounded not by a song, but by a hum that felt like the earth purring. You closed your eyes. The hum wasn't music in the usual sense. It didn't rise or fall. It didn't tell a story. It simply existed, and in its presence, you felt your body soften further. Your shoulders, already relaxed, sank a little more. Your jaw unclenched. Your breath slowed, drawn deeper now, not out of need, but from a place of ease. The hum seemed to come from every direction, not just the people, not just the fire, but from the ground, the hills, the sky itself. It was as though the world had decided to cradle you, to soothe you in the oldest way it knew how, through sound without language, through presence without purpose. And within that sound, you began to remember something. Not a moment, not a place, but a feeling. The feeling of being carried, of being safe, of being part of something so vast and ancient that your existence was not questioned, not evaluated, but simply folded into fabric like a single thread in a well-worn blanket. You remembered, though you'd never known it before, how it felt to belong to the land not as a visitor, not as a wanderer, but as one of its own. And then the humming faded. Not all at once, not abruptly, but gradually, like morning mist dispersing in slow sunlight, each note drifting away with gentle dignity until only the quiet remained. The fire continued to glow, unchanged, but the air now felt even softer, even warmer, as if the hum had left something behind, an echo or a blessing or both. The stranger looked at you again, and this time they smiled not with their mouth, but with their eyes. The kind of smile you don't return with your lips, but with your heart. You exhaled slowly, and the breath felt round and full, like the closing of a circle. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," you said finally, your voice quiet and slow, almost unsure it needed to be spoken at all. The stranger's smile didn't change. "That's all right," they said. "Most things worth doing don't start with knowing." You sat with that for a while, letting the words unfurl inside you like a long-forgotten letter being slowly read in candlelight. Around the fire, no one had moved, but you sensed they all understood, that they had each, in their own way, sat where you were sitting, carried that same uncertainty, rested beside that same weight, and released it in their own time. Eventually, the breeze returned, cooler now, carrying the faintest scent of sage and smoke and something distant, like rain falling on a desert many miles away. It slid past your cheek and into the folds of your coat, not chilling, just reminding you that the world beyond this fire still turned, still moved, still called. But the fire didn't dim. The warmth didn't leave. The silence didn't tighten. And slowly, gently, your eyelids began to grow heavy, not from weariness, but from peace. A peace born not of answers, but of stillness, of trust, of knowing that wherever this journey led, you had already walked far enough tonight. For now, it was enough to rest. For now, it was enough to listen to the fire and breathe with the land and let the story go on without needing to chase it. The stranger looked once more into flames, and the world, vast and slow and sacred, kept turning. The night had not fallen in the way it often does in stories, with a sudden descent of darkness or the dramatic sweeping in of shadowed clouds. Instead, it had arrived gently, like a familiar friend who knew not to knock, who simply let themselves in and settled into the room without saying a word. The fire still glowed, low now but steady, its light pooled in warm puddles on the ground and on your hands, which rested motionless in your lap. Your eyes, half-lidded, traced the curve of the flame's edge and a faint shimmer heat that rose above it in smooth, pulsing waves. The others around the fire remained still, not asleep, not alert, but resting somewhere in between, a shared space of calm that seemed to deepen rather than fade as time moved forward. The sky had become an ocean above you, vast and dark and rich, the last hints of sunset swallowed into its depths, replaced by a scattering of stars that blinked quietly, like tiny sighs pressed into the heavens. There was no moon yet, just the dark and the stars and the fire and the rhythm of your breath. You were aware of each of these things, but in the way you're aware of your heartbeat, not something to focus on, not something to analyze, but something simply there, gentle, present, enduring. Somewhere beyond the circle, a coyote called distant, slow, not sharp or wild, but long and low, like a question asked of the night, and then another answered, softer still, further off. The sounds did not alarm you. They did not pull you from the warmth or the stillness. If anything, they deepened it, reminding you that the land beyond the fire was alive, too, not with threat, but with mystery. And here, wrapped in the peace of this moment, mystery was not something to solve. It was something to rest beside. You leaned back slightly, your shoulders settling deeper into the earth beneath you. The soil was dry but not hard, the grass sparse but soft, and the weight of your own body felt comfortable now, supported in a way that required no adjustment. Your mind, which in waking life so often moved quickly from one thought to the next, planning, worrying, measuring, remembering, had fallen into sync with the fire's slow rhythm, each flicker seeming to stretch time further, each pop like a gentle comma in a sentence too long to finish tonight. The stranger across from you had shifted once more, drawing their knees up, crossing their arms over in a position of rest so natural it might have been sculpted from the land itself. Their hat now rested beside them on the ground, and you could see more of their face, a face not marked by age in the way you'd expect, but weathered instead by openness, like a canvas that had been exposed to every kind of light and shadow, and had absorbed it all without resistance. Their eyes met yours again, only briefly, and in them you saw something like gratitude, not directed at you, but shared with you, as if the peace of this night was not theirs alone to enjoy, but yours as well, a mutual inheritance simply for having arrived. For a time, no one moved. Even the fire seemed to settle into itself, its flames curling lower, tighter, glowing from within rather than casting outward. The shadows it created no longer danced. They swayed. They pulsed. They rested. And in that stillness, your mind began to drift, not away, but deeper. You began to imagine, not dream, not hallucinate, but quietly envision. Images came, slow and fluid, like memories that belonged not to your life, but to a life nearby. You saw a stretch of river bending beneath a rise of red hills, its banks lined with smooth stones and dry reeds swaying in the wind. You saw a wooden bridge, worn and gray, crossing that river at a narrow point. The ropes weathered but strong, its slats creaking softly beneath the step of a solitary rider. You saw that rider pause, turn their head to the wind, and lift their face to the sky with an expression not of longing or sorrow, but of recognition. And then the image faded, not erased, not gone, but folded back into the fabric of your thoughts, as though it had been a page glimpsed in a book that was now closed again. The fire in front of you had not changed, nor had the others stirred, and the stranger remained in their place, eyes closed now, lips slightly parted in the slow rhythm of sleep or something very close to it. You allowed your own eyelids to drift shut again, the softness behind them like velvet. The sound of the night became a blanket, one stitch from the faint whistle of distant wind, the occasional flutter of wings above, the hush of sleeping grass and the low, even breath of the others around you. It was a song with no melody, a lullaby sung by the land itself, one meant not for children or dreamers, but for anyone who had forgotten how to be still. In the distance, you could sense a change, not near, not immediate, but waiting. The kind of change that doesn't arrive with fanfare, but with a quiet footstep, slow and careful, as though it doesn't want to wake anyone until you're ready to rise. And you knew, in the way the heart knows things long before the mind does, that the journey wasn't over, that the road would stretch again, the wind would call again, the light would change again. But not tonight. Tonight, there were no questions to ask, no choices away, no destination to chase. There was only this circle, this fire, this silence, this sky, and you, breathing quietly with it all. The fire, though now no taller than a curl fist, still held a quiet, pulsing glow, and each flicker within it rose like a tired breath before folding gently back into the ash. Around it, the circle remained intact, unbroken not by bonds or duty, but by something much softer, shared stillness. You sat there, unmoving but not stiff, your body so fully relaxed that you no longer felt the individual aches of the day. There was no pressure on your shoulders, no weight behind her eyes. Only a kind of floating presence, a soft beingness that wrapped around you like a wool blanket, left a warm on a stone hearth. The stars above had multiplied. Thousands now, maybe more, each one blinking quietly into place like they were arriving not from above, but from within the night itself. They didn't sparkle. They shimmered. They pulsed faintly, slowly, and between them the sky seemed vast beyond measure, yet somehow close enough to touch, as if all the universe had tilted slightly toward this campfire circle just to watch, just to listen. The air had cooled further, and the scent of the earth had deepened, dust, dried grass, ash, and the faint memory of something green, as if a river once ran near here a very long time ago, and its scent still lingered, patient and ghost-like in the soil. One of the others around the fire shifted, just enough to pull their coat tighter across their chest, and the gentle brush of fabric was the only sound for a while, apart from the occasional soft crackle from the dying fire. No one spoke, but again, it didn't feel like absence, it felt like reverence, as though language had been given the night off, as though meaning could be carried in the smallest movements and the slowest breaths. The stranger, the one who had walked beside you earlier in the day, was still seated across from you, their figure now half shadow, half glow. Their face was turned slightly upward, not in a dramatic way, but with quiet curiosity, watching the stars as though waiting for something unspoken, something subtle and true that could only be seen with eyes that didn't blink too quickly. You followed their gaze and found yourself scanning the sky too, not looking for signs or patterns, just letting the enormity of it wash over you. The constellations, if they were there, didn't draw your attention. Instead, it was the space between the stars that you noticed, the soft, deep black of the void that somehow didn't feel empty at all. And then quietly, gently, you heard a sound not from the fire or the night or the others, but from inside yourself. It wasn't a thought, not a word, not even a feeling. It was a kind of recognition, a slow warmth rising in your chest that felt like remembering the name of someone you hadn't seen in years, but who had always been there in the background of your memory, waiting for you to notice them again. It wasn't joy. It wasn't sadness. It was something older, a kind of knowing. You sat with it, letting it rise and settle, and as it did, you felt your connection to this place deepen, not as a visitor or dreamer, but as someone returned to a place you'd never physically been, but had always somehow known, a place that existed outside of time, where the world didn't end or begin. It simply existed in a gentle loop of breathing and silence and firelight. The stranger stirred, not to speak, but to reach into a small pouch at their side and retrieve something that looked like a small, flat stone or a piece of carved wood. They didn't hold it out. They didn't announce it. They simply turned it slowly in their hands, letting the firelight touch its surface. You watched it gleam faintly, catching hints of shape and texture. Perhaps a figure, perhaps a symbol, perhaps nothing more than a smooth pattern from years of touch. It was clear that whatever it mattered, not because it was rare or powerful, but because it had been held and carried and kept close for a very long time. You found your gaze drifting from it back to the stranger's face, and in that moment they looked up at you, not intensely, not suddenly, but with calm eyes that had seen far and judged little. Their voice, when it came, was low, barely louder than the fire's last exhale. "There's nothing you need to take from here," they said, "but if something stays with you, let it." You nodded, not needing to respond in words. Something was already staying. Something had already settled into your bones like warmth, like memory, like rest. The others around the fire hadn't moved, but you could sense a kind of agreement in the air, as if each one of them had once heard those words in their own way, had accepted them, and had carried something with them ever since. Not a burden, not a souvenir, just a piece of quiet that belonged to this land, and had chosen to follow them back into the noise of the world beyond. The fire was almost out now, its core still glowing faintly, a bed of coals more than flame, their light no longer reaching the edges of the circle. And yet the darkness didn't feel oppressive. It felt close, like a shawl drawn over the shoulders by gentle hands. Your breath, soft and deep, echoed in your ears now, and with each slow inhale, you felt yourself sinking, not downward, not away, but inward, like a river finally reaching the still lake it had been flowing toward all along. The wind stirred one final time that night, brushing over the camp gently, lifting the edge of your coat, and then settling again as if it had finished what it came to do. There were no goodbyes, no endings, no parting rituals. Only the silence and the warmth and the stars. You close your eyes, not to sleep, not yet, but to listen with your skin, to let the moment sink into you fully, to let the land mark you with its softness. And as the last coal sighed and the dark grew deeper still, you smiled, because you understood now. You hadn't woken in the wild west to escape something or to solve something. You had woken to rest, to remember, to belong. The last of the coals had grown dim now, their glow buried beneath a thin crust of pale ash, and the darkness that settled in their place was not frightening but tender, like the closing of eyelids after a long, contented day. The fire had offered its warmth, its light, its rhythm, and now it had bowed into rest just as you had, the final embers sighing without ceremony. No one reached to stir it. No one added wood. It was not the kind of fire that needed to burn through the night. It had done what it came to do. And in its fading, something gentle unfolded in its place, a deeper stillness, a quieter silence, something even the flames had made room for. The circle remained, though it was nearly invisible now. You could feel its presence, not in sight, but in the soft awareness that each of you, all seated in the hush of this prairie night, remained tethered together by something that didn't need names. The people, still and silent, were no longer strangers, though you knew so little about them. Their shapes were only silhouettes now, barely distinguishable from the surrounding dark, but you sensed their breathing, slow and even, and it comforted you like the sound of rain against a roof. Constant, distant, close. You lay back slowly, the earth cool beneath your spine, the ground forgiving and familiar. The grass crinkled beneath you, sparse and dry, brushing softly against your sleeves. The stars above stretched wider now than they had before, the sky feeling impossibly large and close all at once, as if it had been draped just above your chest like a velvet quilt. There was no moon yet, just a deep, rich expanse peppered with points of light, some blinking, some steady, all humming a quiet kind of song that had nothing to do with sound. And in this darkness, your eyes no longer searched for meaning. They simply received. The stars were not guides or omens or signs. They were just themselves, old, glowing things still shining after lifetimes of silence. You didn't need to understand them to be comforted by them. They didn't ask anything of you, and so you asked nothing of them in return. You just lay there, breathing with them as if you, too, had been set in place long ago and needed only to remain. The wind had stilled. Earlier it had whispered, then rested, then circled back again like a thoughtful visitor checking the door one last time. But now it seemed to have settled, folded itself into the folds of the land, become part of the quiet. The night was no longer moving forward. It had paused, suspended itself gently around you, waiting, not for anything to happen, but just for you to be. You became aware of your own body again, not as an object, but as a vessel, your chest rising and falling, your fingers curled lightly against the dust, your knees bent slightly, your breath moving as slowly as the stars above. Nothing hurt, nothing strained, and even the thoughts that had trailed after you earlier, worries, questions, memories, loose ends, all of them had dropped away like loose feathers caught on a breeze that had since vanished. There was only this moment, and you, and the knowing that no one needed anything from you here. Somewhere far off, you thought you heard an owl. A low, soft call carried by the cool night air, not urgent, not sharp, just there. Another voice in the dark, another being awake in the stillness. And it made you feel less alone, not because you'd been lonely, but because the presence of something else, alive and unseen, felt like a kind of grace. You turned your head slightly and saw, in your periphery, the stranger still seated, legs crossed, hands resting loosely on their knees. Their hat remained on the ground beside them. Their eyes, now visible, were open, but they did not blink much. They weren't looking at anything. They were simply open, taking in, reflecting back the dark without trying to pierce it. They didn't speak. They didn't move. But in that moment, you understood that they weren't here to teach or lead or show you something. They were simply here, like the owl, like the stars, like the fire had been. They were part of the land's language, part of its stillness. A single note in its long, quiet song. And you were part of that song now, too. You'd come here without knowing how, without asking why. You'd walk with empty hands and an unsure step. You'd watch the windmill turn, the grasses sway, the dust settle. You'd entered the house and stood beneath its silent bell tower. You'd followed the stranger's voice, rested beneath the crooked tree, joined the circle, felt the hum. And now, here you were, lying on your back beneath a night that had no edge, watching stars blink softly above the sleeping plain. Nothing had changed in any dramatic way, and yet everything had. You were still you, but lighter, as if the weight you carried, whatever it had been lifted not all at once, but gradually, so gently you hadn't noticed until it was already gone. No one had taken it from you. No one had told you to set it down. It had simply slipped away, melted into the dust, the air, the flame, absorbed by the land. And now, the only thing left was peace. A long, steady, quiet peace that wrapped around your limbs and tucked behind your ears and settled deep into the folds of your thoughts. A peace that didn't require you to sleep, but made you want to, not from exhaustion, not from escape, but because resting here felt like the truest form of belonging. The night waited with you, the stars watched with you, and your breath, slower than ever, matched the rhythm of the land. You didn't know how long you'd been lying there. Time, once so sharp and insistent, had faded entirely from your awareness, replaced by something far older and more forgiving. Rhythm, pulse, breath, the slow unfurling of silence like water spreading across dry stone. The night had not grown darker nor lighter. It had simply deepened, thickened gently like a blanket, settling into the creases of a sleeping body. Every inch of you had softened now, every limb grown quiet, every thought rounded off the edges. The earth beneath you no longer felt like something you lay upon, but something you were slowly becoming part of, your outline blurring into its warmth as your breath slowed to match its ancient pace. Somewhere nearby, a small breeze stirred again, but not to announce itself. It was more like a reminder, a gentle brush against your cheek, as though the land itself had reached out with soft fingers to let you know it hadn't forgotten you. It carried no scent this time, no dust or sage or ash, just coolness, faint and clean, the kind that follows deep after stillness, not before it. And as it passed over your skin, you felt no chill, only acceptance. The way a lullaby wraps around a child's ear, or the way sleep arrives not when it's summoned, but when it's allowed. You open your eyes again, not because anything had changed, but because you wanted to see it all once more before letting yourself slip fully beneath the surface of rest. Above you, the stars remained exactly where they had been, still, watching. You didn't try to count them or name them. You simply let them exist, blinking slowly in the velvet night. A sky full of ancient witnesses who had watched countless fires burn low, countless travelers lie back in the dirt, countless breaths taken in silence. And now they were watching you, not with judgment or curiosity, but with something that felt like welcome. The figures around the circle were nearly invisible now, just the faintest impressions against the dark, like memories etched into soft cloth. But you could still sense them, not their names, not their stories, but their presence. The way you can sense someone standing behind you without hearing them. A closeness that needs no words. They hadn't left, and neither had you. You were all still here, still part of the stillness, still caught in the gentle hush that had fallen over the land like mist. And then, somewhere beyond the fire pit, perhaps near the edge of the circle, perhaps further off, you heard a sound, a quiet one, not startling, Not sharp, just a soft, rhythmic tapping, almost like a stone gently striking wood. It came at intervals, not regular, but not random either. Tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. Tap. You didn't sit up, didn't rise, but your ears tilted toward it, listening not for meaning, but for texture. It wasn't threatening. If anything, it was comforting, familiar, though you couldn't say how. And slowly, you began to realize what it reminded you of. A hammer on a post, a boot heel against a porch rail, a spoon in a tin cup. The everyday music of a place that had lived long before you arrived and would live long after you were gone. The sound faded just as quietly as it had come, not disappearing, but folding back in the land the way water returns to the soil, gently, patiently, without need for ceremony. You closed your eyes again, and this time, when you did, you didn't feel like you were closing them on the night. You felt like the night was closing its eyes too. With you, the land seemed to breathe slower still, if such a thing were possible, and your own breath followed suit. You noticed the spaces between each inhale and exhale growing longer, not from effort, but from ease, like your body had decided it didn't need quite so much air anymore, like it had learned to live on stillness. And in that stillness, a story began to unfold. Not a memory, not a dream, but something quieter. A series of moments, layered one atop the other like pages in a forgotten book. You saw the river again, winding its silver path beneath moonless skies, its surface rippling not from wind, but from the quiet movement of unseen fish beneath. You saw a lantern swinging gently from a porch beam, casting a small circle of gold on the ground where a pair of boots rested, their laces undone. You saw the flicker of candlelight through a window pane, behind which someone wrote slowly in a book with pages curled from use. You didn't know who these people were. You didn't need to. It was enough to know they existed, that they had lived and moved and breathed in the same quiet world you now rested in, that their moments had passed not with noise, but with grace. And as you lay there, arms at your sides, breath barely rising from your chest, you felt their presence join yours, not as ghosts, not as visions, but as echoes, as gentle footprints layered into the dust beside your own. The stranger, though still silent, seemed to notice too. You sensed their head tilt slightly, the way someone might incline their ear to better catch a distant melody, or the way a horse lifts its face toward the wind. They didn't speak, but in the pause that followed, it felt as if something had been acknowledged, some crossing of invisible threads between past and present, dream and waking. And in that pause, you made peace with the truth that had been waiting for you since the beginning. That this was not a place you had come to learn something, or fix something, or change something. It was a place to be quiet, to be still, to be human, to be allowed. The sky above had not moved, and yet it felt closer now, like it had leaned in to whisper secrets into your skin. You didn't need to hear the words. Their meaning was already settling into you like soft ash into cracks in old wood. You let out a slow, final breath of the night, and the silence received it like a gift. The breath you had just released was not like the ones that came before it. It had weight, yes, but not the weight of burden. Rather, the soft heaviness of release. As it slipped from your lungs and into the air around you, it was met not by resistance or wind or echo, but by quiet. A quiet so deep and accepting that it seemed to hold your exhale in its palms like a fragile bird, and then let it drift upward, where it dissolved invisibly into the dark. And in that single breath, you felt the last threads of waking loosen, like a collar unfastened or a curtain drawn aside in a dim room where nothing needs to be seen anymore. You were no longer thinking of where you had come from, or how this strange, beautiful place had unfolded around you. There was no need for questions. No edges left to the experience that required pushing against. The world was not asking anything of you now, not even understand. It was simply asking you to rest. And you, at last, were ready to say yes. The sky above remained unchanged in its appearance, but it felt closer somehow, as though the stars, satisfied with your quietness, had decided to come down just a little bit nearer, their distant shimmer now a quiet rhythm just above your chest. You felt them not as points of light, but as companions. Not watching, not judging, just being, existing with you, sharing space in this night where nothing was required and everything was allowed. Your body was still, yet it didn't feel heavy. If anything, it felt like it was no longer entirely anchored. Your fingers rested on the ground, but you didn't feel the dust between them. Your legs were stretched and folded in some gentle pattern, but there was no tension in them. It was as if you were hovering just slightly above the earth, not lifted, not floating, but held, like the land itself had cupped you in its quiet hands and was now rocking you slowly into sleep. You could sense the others around you were still present, still quiet, still part of the same hush. The stranger, too, the one who walked beside you, remained across the darkened fire circle, though now even their shape had softened into the night. You couldn't see their face anymore, and you didn't need to. What mattered wasn't sight. It was trust. The deep, slow trust that had settled into your bones like warm from a hearth-long burnout, but still hot beneath the ash. You were not alone, and yet you were utterly at peace. You turned your head slightly, just enough to face the open sky directly above. You let your eyes rest half-lit on a patch of stars that shimmered like frost on cold glass, distant and unmoving. You didn't blink much now. You didn't need to. Even the act of blinking felt like it might stir the air too much. So you let your eyes drift downward into half-closed stillness, the stars blurring slightly into soft, comforting shapes. No longer stars, really, but tiny resting lights scattered across a sky that had known countless sleepers before you. And then, through your breath and the silence and the comfort, you began to hear something. Not a sound, exactly, and not music either, but something in between. A rhythm, a cadence, like footsteps on soft earth. But they were not approaching, not retreating. They were simply circling, not around you, not around the fire, but within everything. It was as if the world itself was walking in slow loops now, not in any hurry, not trying to arrive, just moving because it loved to move. You felt that rhythm enter your own breath again, your chest rising and falling in slow motion, your limbs resting heavier still into the soil. It was like the old pulse of something larger than thought, a heartbeat of the land, the stars, the sky, the silence. And you, so small beneath that vastness, felt no need to make yourself larger. You belonged exactly as you were, a breath in the wind, a weight in the grass, a shape in the hush. The air cooled even more now, the last of the warmth from the fire fading into the earth, and yet your body didn't shiver. There was no discomfort. You were wrapped in something that had nothing to do with blankets or coats, wrapped in the long, slow night itself, cradled in the deep knowledge that no one would come looking for you, no bells would ring, no voices would call out your name. Here, in this unmarked place with no path and no map, you become something simple and still and whole. You let your breath pause for a moment, not held, not controlled, just gently suspended between inhale and exhale. And in that pause, you realized this wasn't a dream. It was something truer, something closer to the center of things. The kind of moment that people spend lifetimes trying to find, searching through mountains and temples and books in silence, only to discover that it had been here all along, hidden inside a still night, beneath a quiet sky, next to a fire that asked nothing and gave everything. Your eyes closed completely now, not with effort, not with surrender, but with peace. The fire had gone out. The circle had faded into shadow, and yet the warmth remained. The story remained. You remained, and somewhere in the wide silence of night that never needed to end, the world exhaled with you. The silence now was complete, not empty, but full of breath, full of memory, full of 1,000 tiny things that had no names and needed none. You lay there in the dark, still and content, and the land lay with you, not beneath you, not around you, but with you, as if it had chosen to lie down beside you and rest too. The grass no longer rustled. The stars no longer blinked. Even the wind, that faithful companion that had wandered in and out of your journey all night, had curled up somewhere nearby and fallen asleep. There was no sense of time passing, no need to measure minutes or moments, no rise of urgency, no push of thought. You existed here now in a space beyond counting, a place so quiet that your very heartbeat felt like a conversation. It pulsed gently in your chest, matching something far older than yourself. The rhythm of the world, the drumbeat of dirt and root and stone, the slow turning of the sky above a sleeping plain. You had seen no town, No clock tower, no trail markers. And yet you had arrived. You had found what people search for in maps and books and promises. You had found rest. Not the kind that comes from exhaustion, but the kind that comes from being seen. By the land, by the sky, by yourself. The kind that comes not from answers, but from quiet. And the stranger, your companion through so much of this night, remained where they had been, their presence now as subtle and complete as the wind. You couldn't see them anymore, not clearly, but you knew they were still there, and that they always would be in some way or another, not as a guide, not as a symbol, but simply as someone who had once sat beside you at a fire and said nothing, and in doing so had said everything. Your breath was so soft now that even the night barely noticed it. The stars, those patient, ancient lights, continue to shine not above you, but around you, as though you had become part of the sky itself. Another flicker, another small piece of brightness in the quiet dark. You had no questions left to ask. No need to move, to rise, to understand. The land had accepted you, and in return, you had accepted yourself. You were not in a dream. You were not in a memory. You were in a moment that had no beginning and no end. And though the fire was gone, the warmth remained in your chest, spreading slowly, calmly, like the slow unfurling a story told not in words, but in breath, in stillness, in sleep. So now let your breath deepen. Let your thoughts drift like dust in moonlight. Let yourself float into the quiet, where the story no longer needs to be told, because the night is holding you, the earth is remembering you, and the stars are keeping watch. Thank you for listening. If this gentle journey brought you peace, consider subscribing to join us again beneath another quiet sky. Until next time, sleep well